Didn't take any hostages, and we're ready to roll through a really busy day here. And our first speaker, I don't have any messages, thank goodness. Our first speaker is the Public Affairs Officer at the National Hurricane Center. Maria Torres is the third person to hold that position, and we always say third time's the charm. So Maria, let's hear what you got.
All right, everybody, good morning. Can you all hear me? Everybody can hear me? All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. First off, Alex and Tim, this is great to be back to the Valley after being here for so long. So for those of you that do not know me, before I was in the public affairs position, I worked at the forecast office in Brownsville, Texas for 5 years, so I did from 2011 all the way until 2016, and that's where I got my first close relationship with the media and working more closely with the media. So we did a lot of work here while Steve Drillette was the MIC back then, and we had Barry Goldsmith also as the WCM. So we did a lot of work for the media here, and it was really, really good to be here during that time. And then from there, that led me eventually into the forecast office in Miami, and also at the National Hurricane Center in Miami as well. So anyhow, so today what I'm going to be talking to you about is the media operations on how we handle things at the National Hurricane Center. Okay, so let's see. All right, easy, not difficult at all. Okay, so yeah, then so one of the things that I wanted to go over is how we're doing the media operations, especially during the season and off season. And I will show you some of the pictures of what we've done before and how we changed some of these things and how they change through time, and what we're doing now at the Hurricane Center. Also, how we incorporated the social media and the virtual interviews, as well as we have increased a lot, especially after COVID. So we included that into our media operations more now than ever. And we're also having a lot of demand of Spanish media interviews, and that's one of the things that we also were able to add into our media operations during this time, in this past year. So yeah, so what's important for us? I think one of the biggest things for us is that it's very essential that we are really close with our media partners, and it's really important to have that connection with them as much as we can. Make sure that we are able to communicate with them and they have a close relationship with us. If there is a message that we need to take out, that's our way for us to provide that information. And so it's really important that we keep that relationship with them, and we do that throughout the whole year, so we have that close connection throughout the season. And one of the biggest things, so here's a list of some of the media partners that we are constantly in contact with, and they're always available to reach out to us, and I reach out to them if there's something that needs to be fixed, or there's something that is incorrect in some sort of article or anything like that. We try to talk to them and make sure that we make those corrections. So yeah, like the NHC media operations, especially during the off-season, one of the biggest things that we do is we try to focus on the educational outreach, and we talked about how do we prepare before, during, and after the storm. We try to focus on that very hard. We do that campaign goes out all the way from here on March into April, and then all the way into June 1st. We try to focus very closely with how to the educational part of things, from all the different hazards, and the whole team goes into preparedness and making sure that we send the message out as much as we can. On top of that, we try to focus on what are the different changes that we're having for the year. So we focus, okay, what are the changes that we're implementing in the products, the graphics, and we do a full campaign making sure that we educate the public as much as we can before the season begins. Also, you can see on some of these images, there's different formats that we use whenever we are at the Hurricane Awareness Tour or we are at the Caribbean Hurricane Awareness Tour. We try to go into, so we have, the team goes into the actual tour, and we provide on-scene interviews right on the scene, so the airplane, the planes, they grab a lot of attention. So this is a good opportunity for us to be there. They can meet us, they can see what we're doing, and connect with the media during those times. And we also have in-person interviews inside the building, and also the virtual option as well, especially when we're doing conferences like this. Now, during the season, we shift gears a little bit. Our focus is more on the operational side of things and what's going on in the tropics. And during that time, what we try to do is we're trying to focus on that. So we're basically making sure that we provide the media support whenever there is a storm and there is a threat for the U.S. and its territories. So we try to keep that communication going, especially when there is a storm. Now, the biggest thing is that there is a huge inflow of demand that everybody wants an interview. And it can be very overwhelming to the point where you're like, oh my gosh, you get to the office and you're like 100 emails and everybody wants an interview. And they're focused on, okay, what is going on with the storm? If there's a storm or there's a tropical wave, what's the latest situation with this invest? Anything that has to do with anything that we have right out there in the tropics they want to know about. So we get, it's overwhelming. It gets to a point where it's very overwhelming, and we cannot provide it as fast as we can. So we need to have a very coordinated approach. And just to show you, this is right now Mike Brennan in one of the English media desks that we have. So we're providing an interview back then, but definitely that inflow does make a big difference, and that's where the challenge comes in, making sure that we successfully give those interviews out, we get the message out, but how do we do it in a very coordinated way that we keep the message, we are successfully at it. And here, so you can see back then, let me show you. This is how, maybe this is gonna bring a couple of memories for some of you guys. So that's Bob Sheets, and he was actually the director back then, and he gave some interviews. He was sitting right next to the CRT's TVs. You guys remember some of those TVs, and definitely things have changed. The graphics has changed, and you can see now Jamie on our English media desk, where we have a touchscreen, and we also have he has availability to do any annotations into it and do all these different things, have access to all that from our media desk. And on top of that, we added a media wall that Jamie was behind that very closely last year. So we did incorporated that into the back wall, and basically, it gives us some more situational awareness for the operation side of things, and the specialists have access to have a more situational display available there, and it also gives them a chance to look at the data more closely, and they can coordinate, and we can switch depending on what we need. But it's really neat to have that available there, and also we're doing virtual interviews as well, so we have other options within the operations floor. So another thing that we had back then was we had the top of the hour generics, and probably, Bill, you remember a little bit about that. Anyway, so these top of the hours were mainly at the beginning of the hour, where we just had a recorded and live a minute and 30-second segment where the director would give a short review update of what the conditions were with the advisory, and they will focus on what are the latest changes with the storm as it was approaching, and we would provide that with every advisory at the top of the hour. So we tried to see if there was a need for it, because a lot of people were not actually looking at this information. So we noticed that this is something that a lot of people were not utilizing it, so we decided to eliminate it completely for the 2023 season, 2022 season, and we are not doing much of this anymore. But one of the things that we have is now that we're giving the live streams, and are helping us give this information, and people are using them. So also, this is another big issue that we had back then. So we had a lot of the media that would come into the Hurricane Center, and they could go into the operations area. And you can see back where in the picture to the side there, you can see that a lot of people were coming inside the operations area where the forecasters and the specialists were working. So we said, no more of that. there has to be some boundaries, so we have to push back, and then we have to have everybody back. So now, this is what we are, where we are at now, where we just have one cameraman, and that's his equipment box there, and he's only controlling that camera, and then we have the media desk in the back where they can see the backdrop of everything that we have with the video wall and the screen, but everything is a more clean, more organized, and they have their space to work, and we also have they also have the media side of the media room is on this side of that you don't see it, but it's outside this side, and it helps keep the message, keep everything organized in a way that they have their space to work. And so so that brings me back to the media pool. Then for us, in order to keep that organized approach to things, how does that work? How do we work the whole media pool? So that's where we incorporated what we call the media pool. So the media pool, just to give you an idea, is just a media pool is the agreement that we have in place, and it's with 8 different networks that are part of that agreement, and they're part of a coordinated rotation. In that rotation, they switch every hour throughout the event. So as soon as we open the pool early in the morning, they start with that rotation, and those 8 members within the network, they rotate, okay? So, and also the other thing in that coordinated rotation, that includes the producer that they provide the photographer and the engineers. If there's anything that breaks with the camera, the equipment in the back rooms and anything, is part of that agreement, and they take care of it. So just to give you an idea, if you look on the table to the left there, you see these are the members for the 2023 season. And right now, the first one on the list is CNN. So CNN will have that first top of the hour for the first, as soon as we open the pool. But then what happens is that the CNN will fall on the 8th place, and then Weather Nation will take the first place at that point after the hour. So you can have up to 10 hits in 1 hour providing those interviews. And there's also, we included some breaks, short breaks for the team just to recover, did you have update the graphics, make sure that, they have some time to downtime in order to get back again, because it can be one after the other. So it's 5 minutes one and nonstop. So we added that there. Okay. So the way that it works, once we have system, there's something that we're looking already, we start the internal coordination inside NAC with Jamie and the group and Mike. And once we start that coordination, we decide whether, okay, when are we going to be starting this media pool, and when are we going to open if we need it. And in some cases, when we do need it, then we would activate the producer, we activate the photographer, they're activated, they come into the National Hurricane Center to set up, and we send the media advisory out. Once we send the media advisory, we let the people that are on the threat, the potential threat, to know that the media pool will be open. Once it's open, what's going to happen is that the producer will start getting all the phone calls for the requests for those interviews, and that she will start adding them into the grid. So CNN will just have that top of the hour, then they have that priority at the top of the hour. If CNN doesn't want that interview and they want to give away that 5-minute block, then we can go ahead and give it out to someone else. But they have to let us know, at this time for that hour, I'm not available, I'm not going to take the interview, you can go ahead and give it out to somebody else. And that's exactly what happens. So the producer is aware of that. They start making all these, they start adding all the interviews as they come into the grid. And by the time that the media pool opens, we just have the talent go into the setup and everything, and all we need to do is add them into the earpiece, and they're ready to go. Also, the other thing that we did was, there is a lot of requests that comes in before the event, before the advisories are out. So one of the biggest things that we noticed, that in order for us to eliminate and avoid, the wrong message to go out, we want to make sure that we start sending that information as early as possible. We have a lot of requests that do some of the requests that do come in. So what we do, we start doing a limited pool before we open a full pool. So the limited pool, it's what we're trying to do is open it up for 4 blocks, 4-hour block in the morning and in the evening. A couple of days before, there are actually advisories out, so that way we're able to start having people provide the interviews early on. And within that, we also include the forecast preparation blackouts that I mentioned a little earlier. Okay, now, once the threat materializes and we're seeing that there is something that we're keeping an eye on, what we're starting to do this year was focus, make sure that we started providing some of the virtual live stream. And I don't know if you guys did see a little bit of that, and I know Craig did a lot of work with us on that, so thanks so much on setting it all up and helping us with all our setup that in the National Hurricane Center. So the main thing once we're doing these live streams is to make sure that we focus on keeping everybody calm, but focus on what they need to do to prepare for the events. And if they have to start looking at their emergency kit, or they have to start looking at all of that, and double check their preparedness kits and things like that, we go ahead and try to bring that up now and bring that up to their attention so they start thinking about it before there's already in a close proximity to them. So this has been a very good success. So one of the things that we've used is the Blackmagic ATOM, which is the broadcast switcher board that we're using, and that you can see it on the left. And we're also using, that gives us a chance to have a banner, also adding more graphics for the group to be able to show whatever they want to show, their graphics. And so it helps us out a lot. And also the caster, we're using that program, which is also helping us basically stream out into the 3 different platforms. So right now, what we're doing, it's actually going into simultaneously on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And we also send an announcement ahead of time, letting people know that we are planning on doing a live stream and they can check us out, and which is one that we did for Ian. All right, so now moving a little bit into the virtual interviews. For the virtual interviews, we started doing a more, there was a lot of requests. Let's say, for example, if there is a station that is not part of the network and they're not able to get a connection because they're not part of the network, then the best thing that we can offer is actually do it through a virtual option. And what we have is a room in the back where it's an enclosed media room where we are actually making sure that the producer, if she's receiving a request and it's not part of the network, then she can go ahead and actually help them maybe direct it through the virtual option. And it's been helping us a lot. And the other option, the other thing that we're adding to that is that we're able to give English and Spanish interviews in that room, following with that schedule. So it's separated. It's not interrupting the network in any way. They're both running at the same time in just separate areas, and it's not interrupting anybody. This one is in the Miami office. So Miami, since you know it's co-located with the National Hurricane Center, Miami sometimes, if they have the staff, they help us out as well with interviews. If it's for the Miami area, they'll take care of Miami. But if there's something that we cannot handle, they'll also sometimes have the availability and help us out with that. But for our side of things at the Hurricane Center, while I was working in the Tropical Analysis and Forecast branch with Chris Lancy, one of the things that the staff, there's people that they're bilingual, they are comfortable providing interviews. So one of the things that we talked about is how can we start incorporating them and having them available for interviews in Spanish. And the biggest thing is that the staff is working operational shifts. So whenever there's a storm, then they switch to a 12-hour shift. So do we have enough to actually take them out of the rotation and have them available for Spanish interviews? And we were able to work a way around it where if I only have one person, I'm doing a big difference already, just having one bilingual person on the floor providing those requests, because it's incredible the amount of interviews that are the demand that's coming in, even in the bilingual side of things, it's incredible. So it's been really helpful to have that. So Chris, thank you so much on helping on that. And and this is Gladys Rubio. She used to work at the Weather Channel in Espanol way back, and she's back again and ready to go, and she's loving it and been helping us tremendously this past season. So we did a lot of work on making sure that we were able to do that in Spanish as well. And on top of that, we were able to do radio, print, and virtual in Spanish as well for all three, for in English and in Spanish. All right, so just to give you a media summary on Ian, the media advisory went out for the limited media pool. That went on Friday, September 23rd. And we provided that limited media pool, just basically those 4-hour blocks that I spoke about earlier. And we did that for Saturday and Sunday. And after that, on Monday, that's when we opened the full pool. So we started early from 7 a.m. all the way until 7 p.m. And we extended the hours depending as we were getting closer up to 11 p.m. at night. During those 2 days, especially on Monday, we also provided a press conference where the FEMA administrator came down and she was able to join Jamie at the Hurricane Center. We provided a media advice, a press conference, and just bringing it up to the attention of people that this was a pretty dangerous situation, and try to get the message out and have the media just spread the information out as much as we could. During the whole event, we ended up doing until it made landfall in Florida and then also up north. So we had a total of 13 live streams and in total, and also we did 282 interviews, provided that throughout the whole event. And of that covered, networks, also local affiliates that we had, cable weather broadcasts, virtual interviews, Spanish, radio, print, in both languages. And so yeah, we try to cover as much as we could. And I think for being my first media pool running it, I think we did pretty good. So everything was running, we're good, so the message was going out. So. All right, so I think that's all I have, and this is Dennis Falcon, and he was the previous public affairs officer, and I replaced him now. So thanks again. I don't know if anybody has any questions.
Questions for Maria?
Yeah, questions.
Questions? I have one that,
Yeah, tell me.
from my memory cell in there. Do local media come there in person anymore, or are they all doing it remote? Like?
Yeah, we haven't had after COVID, with everything with COVID, we just try to keep very limited amount of people inside the building. I know the latest time that we had media inside was during Irma, and it was a very limited amount of people again, because we want to keep the crowd as less as we can. The advantage of just having that cameraman there, it helps them, it reduces also the amount of money that they're spending, because they don't have to send the reporter out. They don't have to bring another camera photographer into the building. So a lot of them, what they do is then they're sending them outside into the storm, which is not, it's more dangerous, but there's less people coming inside, and the best connection is through our camera person. And
yeah, that's much better, because it gets kind of crowded
Crowded.
in there when you have a full load of media.
Exactly, and that's the biggest thing with this. So we try to limit it as much as we can, and it helps them be focused. It doesn't interrupt their work, and they're doing their interviews back to back, and it runs much smoother. All right, anybody, any other question? Tell me. Jamie.
Yeah, you can relax. I'm not going to ask a hard question. What a lot of people might not know, and what we're sort of saying here with this presentation, is we don't always get the local markets to pick up on this opportunity. And the national media, love it, and Jim's constantly saying, teasing me about it. But often, the majority of people are receiving their message about a hurricane through the local media, and we'd really like to see more local stations pick up this opportunity. We're not looking to clobber your airways. We're looking to just social science telling us that people need to hear it, same thing over and over and over again, and having that second voice come on air and basically say the same thing you guys are saying. I think would really help. So the opportunity is there. If the recognizing that the satellite and all that sort of stuff might be overwhelming. What Maria was talking about, we can do Skype, we can do, whatever
Zoom,
technology, Zoom, whatever,
yeah.
to make the cost of admission for you, simpler. So that opportunity is there. If people want to ask questions to Maria about how to do that,
Yep.
certainly.
Thanks, Jamie.
Got Craig over here. And then,
And I'm just curious, this is for everybody here, how many people are on the live view matrix at your station? Because one of the things we were trying to do was to see if we put something up on live view and you guys booked, you could just take it in your control room or whatever, and you don't have to do satellite booking or anything like that. And then there's the cost sharing, it's not coming out of you.
Yeah.
Hey, Maria, nice talk.
Yeah.
Quick question about internally, is there any training that happens going into hurricane season with the folks that are doing the interviews at the Hurricane Center? In other words, how to liaise with the media, how to work with media, just in terms of the, not necessarily educated to be media specialists?
So you mean for the media, training for the media?
For the folks at the Hurricane Center who are doing the interviews.
Okay, so yeah, sometimes it's just we don't do a specific media training per se for them as much, but what we do for the specialists provide a media training, especially for the forecasters, where we have a tropical boot camp and we try to work with them and show them how it would be in a situation where in the local office, and how do we handle things here, and how do we handle certain questions, and how to maneuver, make sure that they provide the interviews and focus on what the message is. And I think that's one of the biggest things, and it's been successful. We've been doing it for several years now, and they come into the building and we give them a training during that whole week that they come into NAC. And for us here, they have they look at their videos, they see what they're doing, and we talked about it. Hey, maybe we can work on something for this coming up year, and we also try to look at, okay, what are some of the things that we can just focus for the following year. But we talk about it between us, and they're on top of the other. It's nonstop to the point where it's just they're doing really well. Overall the whole team. So, yeah. That's it. One more.
Travis, microphone's coming to you.
Thank you, Maria, for giving us a peek behind the curtain. Two quick questions. One is, does the blackout apply to all advisories or just the full advisory, the 1 hour blackout?
So the blackout, yeah, it's for the full advisory that we do, and the intermediate, no, we just try to do for the full advisory. And some, they're having internal coordination with the local WFOs during that time, where they're having conversations about the warnings and things that are going out. So all that time, during that time, no interviews are provided. So it's usually from that 10 a.m. to like 11 and 11 a.m. That's where the advisory goes out. And so,
Does that change when you're getting closer to landfall, like when a storm is in the process of landfall, or you're getting closer to that critical window where people are running out of time to make those decisions they need to make in preparation, or do those blackouts continue through the duration?
the blackouts continue. At least they need to work on their advisory. If, yeah, we stick to that. We stick to that. And then what we're doing is that after the 11 a.m., we try to do the live stream right after the 11 a.m. advisory, so that way we can go ahead and send that information out as quickly as we can. But we try to follow that schedule as much as we can. Yeah. Yep, you're welcome.
Yeah.
All right, that's
Excellent.
it.
Yeah,
All
I
right,
remember they actually made me go through some media training when I got there. Apparently my reputation had preceded me on getting there. I like the Miles Lawrence school of interviews. If they ask you a stupid question, answer the one they should have asked. And I actually learned how to do that. That was fun. I really enjoy doing that stuff. And I'm just amazed at how much progress you guys have made at the Hurricane Center on the outreach. All right, I'd like to bring up Andrew FEMATH. It's like FEMA with a TH on it from our great sponsor, USAA. He's going to say a few things about USAA's role and then introduce our next speaker. Andrew?
All right, morning, y'all. My name's Andrew Femath. I'm with USAA, and it's an honor and a privilege to be here. We are a longtime sponsor of this conference, and really just the work that you guys do here that extends throughout the entire year. From an insurance perspective, we rely heavily on y'all's expertise, particularly when it comes to forecasting and predicting those major storms, which is exactly what we're about to get into. Before I welcome Dr. Phillip to the stage, just want to share a little bit about him, which is probably the most highly anticipated session of this conference. Aside from being a meteorologist at Colorado State University, he's responsible for the seasonal Atlantic hurricane forecast, which is what we're going to get into. He developed the 2-week forecast currently issued during peak hurricane seasons, has published dozens of articles in peer-reviewed journals, and just an overall valuable resource for this field of study. So, without further ado, if you can please provide a warm welcome for Dr. Phil Klotzbach.
All right, good morning, everyone. Oh, we're waiting, all right. Oh man, let's see, I got any good jokes this morning. I have to say though, if you're gonna go on the beach or go for a swim, be careful, because I saw a lot of Portuguese man-o-war on the beach this morning, so be careful with that. Anyway, are we good to go? Okay, just a moment, all right. So yeah, we're talking hurricanes this morning. It's a lot of questions about what's going to happen in 2023, and the word you're going to hear a lot in this talk is uncertainty. I did just see that NOAA put out their updated El Nino outlook this morning, so I do not have that graphic in my slide because it was in the last half an hour, but they did up the chances of El Nino from, I think it was 61% for August through October, now it's up to 82%. So that's a big upgrade. I haven't gone back and looked, but I suspect that's probably about the highest probabilities they've had at this lead time, but I have to go back to confirm. Oh, cool, thank you. All right, we good? All right, super. So the seasonal forecast, I have a few tweets queued up ready to go to, but I'm not tweeting while I'm talking. That's the magic of TweetDeck. I tried using Hootsuite once, and it epically failed on the day of the forecast, so TweetDeck all the way. Anyway, so the seasonal forecast, these are the numbers. 13 storms, of those 13, 6 becoming hurricanes, and of those 6, 2 becoming major category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. That's a little bit below the 1991 to 2020 average, which is the current average that NOAA uses, of 14 storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. So we're talking a little bit below the recent average. Just for reference, last year was 14 storms, 8 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes. In addition to, we also forecast this accumulated cyclone energy, which is kind of a geeky metric that accounts for storm frequency, intensity, and duration. So that is basically storms like Irma or Jose in 2017, Dorian in 2019 generate tons of ACE because they're long-lived major hurricanes. Short-lived pieces of junk generate very low levels of ACE. You will also note this year we're forecasting ACE west of 60 degrees west, and I'll talk a little bit about why we think that is hopefully a useful metric as well as we move ahead with the talk. But whenever I do seasonal forecasting, I always like to start by acknowledging the great contributions made by Dr. Bill Gray, who is the founder of the seasonal forecast. This is actually our 40th year of doing CSU's seasonal hurricane predictions. We were doing these long before I came along, so it's 40 years. I think that's pretty cool to have that long of a track record. And if you're having trouble sleeping at night, we do actually have every single PDF of all the seasonal forecasts going back to 1984. We were missing one, but Chris Lancy, who's in the back of the room, happened to have the one, I believe, from August 1988 or something saved. So we have them all scanned. So if you're having trouble sleeping at night, there is an extensive document, I should add, about 40 pages with this forecast. We go into a lot of detail describing all the different models we use, why we're going the way that we are. And it's really helpful at the end of the season when we're going back and trying to verify how good or bad the seasonal forecast was for that particular year. But certainly very fortunate to have had a great opportunity to work with Dr. Gray for over 15 years. In addition to doing the seasonal forecast, he made fundamental contributions to tropical cyclone genesis, structure, intensity change. His papers are cited thousands of times every year, just a giant in the field of tropical meteorology. But Bill Gray was a huge fan of, he was fascinated with hurricanes, but he also was a big fan of philosophy, and one of his favorite philosophers was the great Yankee catcher Yogi Berra, who once stated, "It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future." It's been attributed to some others as well. But I think one of the things with predicting the future is it is extremely difficult. And one way, a good example of that is if you look at the NCAA men's basketball tournament, ESPN had over 10 million brackets submitted. I look back, not one bracket picked all 4 Final Four teams. So forecasting the future is really, really hard. But another statement by Yogi I think is really prescient when it comes to seasonal hurricane prediction is that you can see a lot by looking. Hurricane seasons are not random. There are clues in the atmosphere-ocean system that can kind of tip us off to whether the season is going to be above or below normal. And those clues really start to emerge about this time of year. Unfortunately, it seems like in general the April forecast is the one that gets the most attention, and that's the one that has the lowest levels of skill because really we're still several months, the season officially starts June 1st, but often you don't get much till about mid-August. So we've got a few months left to go, and there's a lot that can change in the atmosphere-ocean system between April and mid-August when stuff really starts to ramp up. But in this time of year, you are starting to get some reasonably good clues as to how busy the upcoming season is likely to be. And so one of the big predictors that I already briefly alluded to, that pretty much everyone who does seasonal forecasting talks about every year is, are we going to have El Nino, are we going to have La Nina, or are we going to have neutral, and so conditions basically near average? And so this is one of the first predictors that Dr. Gray noted way back in the early 1980s. He was teaching tropical meteorology, and he basically was kind of an encyclopedia of knowledge back in the days when you had your Encyclopedia Britannica. I don't think anyone, I guess there's probably a few people who still have those. But anyway, he was basically Wikipedia before there was Wikipedia, and so he knew which years were active hurricane seasons. He knew which years were El Nino years, and he said, hey, we don't really get a lot of intersection there. So he said, okay, he was really big into kind of looking at the data, finding these relationships, and then trying to dive in and understand the physics. And so the question is, why would something going on in the tropical Pacific Ocean impact hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean thousands of miles away? So just as a refresher, here are your typical sea surface temperature anomalies or differences from average between an El Nino year and a La Nina. So warm colors indicate warm anomalies, so warmer than normal water. Blues indicate colder than normal water. And so in an El Nino, the tropical Pacific is hot, much warmer than normal, and La Nina is basically the opposite. The last few years have been predominantly La Nina-like conditions, and in general, pretty robust Atlantic hurricane seasons. In El Nino years, the winds change high up in the atmosphere in such a way that typically reduce Atlantic hurricane activity. So here's a schematic basically showing winds in the troposphere, in the Atlantic Ocean, in the tropical Atlantic. So your low-level winds are the trades, they blow out of the east. Your upper-level winds tend to blow out of the west. So you have in a vertical cross-section, you have vertical wind shear. So low-level winds blowing one way, upper-level winds blowing the other. Vertical shear is detrimental for hurricanes. It tends to encourage, tilts the hurricane circulation. You don't get the pressure fall that you need to really get the winds to accelerate. It tends to encourage mixing in of dry air as well. So in an El Nino, you tend to get a lot stronger upper-level westerly winds, shear apart hurricanes. La Ninas, you tend to have lower levels of shear, and that tends to make, in general, for more active overall hurricane seasons. But we use a lot more than the El Nino-La Nina cycle, and hopefully I'll be able to convince you of that as we go and move ahead further in this presentation. But just to give you an idea, these are the 10 busiest hurricane seasons since 1950, difference from the 10 least busy. And if we look at, here we're looking at water temperatures, and if hurricane seasons were completely random, we would expect this to just be blobs of yellow and red and blue and purple. There are really no rhyme or reason to things, but you see kind of coherent spatial patterns of water temperature anomalies. So again, you see busier hurricane seasons tend to have colder waters in the eastern central tropical Pacific, so that La Nina signal. And really no surprise, the Atlantic tends to be warmer. Warmer water provides more fuel for hurricanes, and that warmer water also tends to lower the pressure, make for a more unstable atmosphere. Overall, just conditions that are more conducive for a busy Atlantic hurricane season. But with that being said, I want to really dive in and talk about what's going on with the current sea surface temperature anomaly pattern. So here what we have is, if you look at the tropical Pacific Ocean, you generally have water temperatures near their long-term averages. So that La Nina that's tended to be there the last few years has gone away. We've had a pretty rapid shift, somewhat more rapid than I guess I was expecting a couple of months ago. So we now have what's known as ENSO neutral conditions. And as I mentioned earlier, NOAA just put out their latest outlook. Their probabilistic forecast gives an 82% chance of El Nino for the peak of the season and a 1% chance of La Nina. So I think it's a pretty good bet that we're not going to have La Nina this summer and fall. If we do, there's going to be a lot of interesting things that are going to have to happen. But also, if you look in the tropical Atlantic, that red rectangle highlights what's known as the main development region. But if we look in the eastern and central Atlantic, there's a lot of orange and even really dark red. So you're talking 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warm anomalies, which is a lot. So that's really kind of why this below normal, or this slightly below normal season is what we're forecasting. If the El Nino is likely to come on, potentially be quite robust, but that Atlantic is really, really warm. So that's kind of the push-pull thing that we're going to be talking about a lot coming up. So here is the current sea surface temperature anomaly pattern. And so the box that NOAA uses to effectively classify El Nino or La Nina events is known as the popularly named Nino 3.4 region. That's the box that they monitor. And basically, when those water temperatures are 0.5 degrees Celsius or more, warmer than normal, for several weeks, they make sure it's not just like a quick blip. They'll declare an El Nino event. Alternatively, when it's 0.5 degree Celsius or more, colder than normal, it's La Nina. And if it's between those, then you have neutral conditions. And I think it's pretty interesting. I mean, 0.5 degree Celsius, 0.9 Fahrenheit, like that seems like a pretty small change, but small temperature changes in the tropics make big differences in then how the atmosphere responds. So right now, again, water temperatures running about average in the tropical Pacific, but you do see a remarkable amount of warmth right on the far right-hand panel. The water temperatures off of Ecuador have been about 3 degrees Celsius warmer than normal, which is the warmest we've seen since 2015. It's really, really warm off of there, and they've had actually a lot of flooding. So that's another potential kind of indicator that we are heading over towards a more El Nino-like conditions. So we've had a lot of these basically. This is looking at upper ocean heat content. So this is averaging like the top 300 meters of the ocean. And so if we're looking at the temperatures across the Pacific Ocean, so on the far on the far left is basically Indonesia. On the far right is effectively the South American coast. So if you look at this figure, you can see in general, the last year, we've had a lot of blues east of the international date line, indicative of this La Nina. And then typically what you see is, you see these kind of these dashes and dotted lines. So these dashed lines are indicative of what's known as downwelling oceanic Kelvin waves. And basically, climatologically, the western tropical Pacific is much warmer. So by Indonesia is much warmer than it is over by South America. So when you get low-level westerly wind events, basically that can transport that warm ocean water from the western Pacific towards the eastern Pacific. And we do see several of these downwelling oceanic Kelvin waves. And when you get a couple or three of these, that can really pull the transition over towards El Nino. We have a pretty robust Kelvin wave currently propagating across the central and eastern, heading into the eastern tropical Pacific. So one of the big things that we monitor is, effectively, are we going to get a lot of low-level westerly winds? And so this is a Hofmüller plot with time going down on the y-axis. And so those two horizontal lines delineate effectively the tropical Pacific Ocean. So basically, in a nutshell, here, oranges indicate winds blowing out of the west, or anomalous winds out of the west. Blues indicate anomalous winds out of the east. If you looked at these Hofmüller plots for the last couple of years, it was pretty much all blue. We had a really robust La Nina and really strong trade winds. That's finally broken down. And we are starting to get more of these westerly wind type events. Oops, let's see, go back. And so really what we're looking at now is the potential for we have some westerly winds in the near term, but then maybe a fairly robust trade wind surge coming down beyond that. So, there's certainly indications we are going to be heading over to El Nino, but it kind of depends exactly how strong this potential trade wind surge is as to how robust that Kelvin wave is going to be. But there is a lot of subsurface warmth going on right now in the tropical Pacific Ocean. This is looking at upper ocean heat content anomalies, again in the top 300 meters of the ocean. And so here, warm anomalies are indicated by orange, cold anomalies indicated by blue, and if we look right now, we can see about 1 degree Celsius warm. So the upper ocean in the eastern and central tropical Pacific is much, much warmer than it was, say, a couple of months ago. And I think that's something important to realize as we move ahead, that we are looking like we are really getting things really transitioning potentially over to El Nino, potentially fairly quickly. There now is officially an El Nino watch posted for the tropical Pacific Ocean. There is a lot of warmth in the subsurface as well. Here are the current subsurface temperature anomalies, and you can see there is a lot of warmth in the subsurface across most of the tropical Pacific Ocean. And again, I think that's important to realize that, and that subsurface warmth tends to basically emerge at the surface if you have a lot of that subsurface warmth, and you get those westerly winds basically transporting that warm water across the basin. So the big question is El Nino coming? Hopefully some of you still remember Chris Farley. I had to put this one back in. He's been out of my slide deck since 2015, so I thought he should make a reappearance here. Are we going to get to El Nino? And so, if you believe the forecast models, the answer is really, really yes. The models are really aggressive at calling for El Nino this summer and fall. This is the latest forecast from the ECMWF, so the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts. All its ensemble members say El Nino. The average of these is like 2 degrees Celsius warmer, which would be put up right up with the strongest El Ninos we've ever observed. So it would be a really, really robust El Nino event. So the European model, however, and most of these climate models have been too warm the last few years. So it's important to realize that too, that these systems, just because every model is saying it, doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to be happen. And the European model, at least the last few years, has had a chronically high bias during the spring. They have a nice archive of all of their forecasts, and you can see often the observed conditions can be outside of all of the ensemble members. So just because, again, it's saying it has a really strong, even its coldest member is effectively a moderate El Nino event. So I think certainly the odds certainly do favor El Nino for this summer and fall, but again, we need to be not necessarily biting whole hog on a 2 degrees Celsius warm anomaly. That would be pushing Jurassic El Nino conditions. So now we're looking at basically a whole pile of other models as well. This will be updated next week. And if we look at these, you can see that most of the models are calling for El Nino. There are a few that are calling for warm, neutral, and so conditions. The black arrow here highlights August through October, the peak 3 months of the season. So you have a whole pile of different models. We have dynamical models, which use the full physics of the atmosphere ocean. We have statistical models, which use historical relationships. If you want to get into the ENSO forecast game, sorry, you're not the first one. And if you love acronyms, this is alphabet soup. This is a fantastic thing. But I don't know, I'm not sure how many people could identify all of those acronyms. I certainly can't tell you what all of those ones are. But anyway, all that's to say, there are some models going for very aggressive warming. Others are calling for an El Nino, but not necessarily quite as strong. This actually, again, was just updated in the last half an hour. So take that 60% and raise it to 80%, and that's what the current forecast is from NOAA. But the Atlantic is also really, really warm right now. These are the current sea surface temperature anomalies in the tropical eastern and subtropical eastern Atlantic. You can see the whole Atlantic is generally warm, but you see a lot of warmth. You may see the Gulf of Mexico being warm. Gulf of Mexico warmth doesn't really correlate very well with basin-wide storm activity or even Gulf storm activity. And I think that's because Gulf of Mexico is always plenty warm to support nasty, nasty hurricanes. It's the matter of getting a disturbance as well as having the shear and the dry air conditions, or shear and enough moisture, or low shear and enough moisture to get storms. But that eastern Atlantic this time of year is really important, not just in the tropics, but also in the subtropics. Because when the waters there are warm, that tends to effectively lower the pressure in the subtropical high region. And when you have a weaker high pressure in the subtropics, that tends to weaken that pressure gradient. And so you get weaker trades and you get less mixing and churning up of the ocean surface that feeds back into warmer conditions throughout the tropical Atlantic for the peak of the season. Not a slam dunk that's going to occur, but that tends to be what happens with those conditions. Overall, sea surface temperatures do correlate. This is the map showing the correlations during the month of April. And so you can see basically if we toggle back and forth, in general you can see it's not a perfect match, but it's a pretty good match for what you would normally expect for an above normal Atlantic hurricane season. So if the El Nino didn't look to be coming on pretty robustly, we'd probably be going for a pretty aggressive forecast coming out of the gate. But here's the latest forecast from the European Center of their sea surface temperature anomalies for the August through October. And so you can see it's calling for a really, really strong El Nino, but also calling for a very warm tropical Atlantic. Some of the models are calling for the strongest El Nino and the warmest Atlantic simultaneously. So there's a lot of uncertainty associated with this outlook. This is kind of an interesting result. This is the forecast from the European Center for Tropical Storm Frequency. And so they call this tropical storm frequency, but basically it's named storms. So tropical storms and hurricanes. And so the average from May through October in their climatological period, which is a little different from NOAA's, is 14. They're actually calling for 15 storms. So actually an above average number of storms and basically a near average number of hurricanes. And I can't go in and dissect exactly what the model is doing, but I'm guessing that's because the Atlantic is so warm, even though they're forecasting a really strong El Nino. I know that they did tend to have a low bias earlier, and so I think they may have done some corrections as well. So anyway, we'll see what transpires. But that's the actual. So these climate models, in addition to forecasting the large scale, actually will spin up tropical cyclone-like vortices. So they basically effectively count those. So that's their forecast. It's basically near to slightly above normal based on their model. Climate forecast system out of the U.S. government also calling for a very robust El Nino as well as a very warm Atlantic. So that signal is pretty consistent between all the different models that I'll be talking about as we move ahead with these predictions. So again, just to remind everyone, it's 13, 6, and 2 are the numbers. And so I wanted to go into now exactly how do these numbers come out? We're not throwing darts at a board. I'm not waking up like my meteorological namesake, the groundhog, Punxsutawney Phil, looking to see if it can see a shadow. There is skill in these predictions, and we use a lot of different tools. And some of these tools are things that Dr. Gray couldn't have done in the early 1980s because climate models, if they were available at all, were in their infancy and really had no skill. Whereas now we actually can get information not just from looking back in a kind of a statistical sense, we can also look forward and use model predictions of things like ocean temperatures, wind fields, and they're not bad. Some of them actually have reasonably good skill. And again, you're not saying, give me a forecast for June 23rd. You're saying, okay, on average, what is June, July, and August going to look like? Things like that. So the longer the period that you average over, the more reliable in general the models are. You kind of get rid of some of the noise. So one of the things that we've done every year, this would be very similar to even what Dr. Gray did back in the early 1980s, is we use statistics, and these are basically using historical relationships between up through, in this case, the end of March, and what goes on in the Atlantic Basin in terms of hurricanes. So it's kind of funny. So Bill Gray started these forecasts in '84, and so at that point he was using data since about 1950. We've gotten kind of hoity-toity. I'm like, well, the data's really becomes a lot more robust once you have pretty good satellite observations, which is about 1979. So the hindcast period that we're using is almost completely different from what Dr. Gray actually used when he started these forecasts, just because the data is more and more reliable. And so that's one nice thing is we now have really good historical data sets, these reanalysis products. So in this case, we're using 3 predictors, 2 in the Atlantic, 1 in the Pacific. And these 3 predictors in combination, we're using the high resolution ERA5 reanalysis for all 3 predictors. So that includes, even for the sea surface temperatures, we used to use the NOAA SST product, but we switched to ERA5, which uses the OSTIA sea surface temperature analysis since 2007. It seems a little more, it tends to correlate a little better with hurricane activity. So with that, we can go back to 1979. And you can see again, basically, you get reasonably good levels of skill on hindcast mode. There are some years where the forecast busts, and that's the way it's going to be in April. You're never going to have perfect seasonal forecasts in April. And again, the climate system is also constantly changing. So the models that we're using now may be shifting in 5-10 years as the climate shifts, because basically which climate modes, how they interact with each other, can change over time as well. So our statistical model forecast is actually really, really bullish for this season. And the reason why it's so bullish is because that eastern Atlantic is really, really warm. So that really pulled up the forecast. Again, this is using data up through March. And so a lot of the reason why we didn't go whole hog with this prediction is because the El Nino looks to be coming on quite strong. So that's one of the reasons why we didn't go that much with the statistical model this year. We also use several different statistical dynamical model forecasts. So these are using, basically, I asked the model, okay, I want to see what the forecast is for sea surface temperatures in these 2 regions. So we're using the tropical Pacific, so that's kind of your ENSO forecast, and then we're looking at the eastern and central, subtropical and tropical North Atlantic. And so the data comes in for the European Center model on the 6th of the month, and for all the other models on the 10th. So, and the data is available for 6 months. So for the European Center model, this is their April results. So that would be for August and September. All the other models are their March predictions. So that would just be for August, because that's as far as we could go. But I did actually run the models for April, just like yesterday, and so they're pretty similar to what they said with their March results. There's not a ton of improvement in ENSO prediction skill from March to April. You get a bigger jump once you get to May. The European Center model is calling for, those are the 2 boxes, calling for record warmth in both. So that's interesting. And it was pretty similar with their March outlook. So when you have 2 predictors, one that basically says, super busy, one saying very, very quiet, you end up with a forecast basically that is a little bit above normal overall, because the Atlantic forecast was for about 3.5 standard deviations warmer than normal. And this is basically the skill of that particular model. It's a little bit lower than the statistical model, but in some ways I like having this because it's almost not completely independent, but it's quite a bit different from the statistics. You're looking at actual forecasts from climate models. And so the forecast from the European Center is for, again, a little bit above normal hurricane season. But we also use 3 other models as well. We use the UK Met Office, the Japan Meteorological Agency, JMA, and the CMCC, which is out of Italy. And all 3 of these models are more near normal, maybe even a slightly below normal. So we tend to go more with some of these just because 3.5 standard deviations is a lot. So I'm not necessarily 100% convinced we're going to be quite that warm. But overall, again, we're forecasting a little bit below normal season out of respect for the potential we could get a really robust El Nino event. So here are the analog years. So basically when we select our analog years, we're looking for years in the past that had conditions most similar to what we currently see, but really more what we expect to see for the peak of the season. And so August through October, we're expecting an El Nino, so we tried to pick analog years that generally had more El Nino-like conditions and generally a warm Atlantic. So, if the European model's right and it's the warmest El Nino on record and the warmest Atlantic on record, there's obviously no exact analog, because if it's both the warmest on record. But you can find years in the past that were fairly similar, and basically depending on how robust the El Nino is, how warm the Atlantic is, you can get all sorts of different outcomes. And so the 8 years that we picked kind of run the gamut. You have several years in here where we're very, very overall pretty quiet, and other years that we're obviously extremely busy. And again, a lot of that's due to just kind of how these 2 things interact. So the years are 69, which was obviously a very robust season, 2002, 2004, 2006, 9, 2012, 14, and 15. And so, for example, like 2004, we were going into an El Nino. Officially, we actually met that criteria for August through October, but it was a pretty weak kind of marginal El Nino event, and obviously extremely busy through September, and then the season really cut off on October 1st as the shear associated with the El Nino really kicked in. 69 was actually kind of an unusual case because we actually had, as best estimates are, a moderate El Nino, and we actually had a really busy season, a lot of stuff in the Caribbean, which normally gets really cut down in the El Nino years. And then a lot of these other years tend to be much quieter because we had pretty robust, strong El Nino events in those years. And it's important to realize with these analogs, this is just looking at kind of the large scale environment. We're not saying, if 2012 is an analog that, we're predicting another Sandy or something like that. What we're saying is just overall the environment is somewhat similar. You can see a large range of outcomes, and that, I think, kind of encapsulates what's going on here. It's just there is a lot of uncertainty with these predictions. So we also do probabilities of exceedance to try to kind of give you an idea of the uncertainty associated with the forecast. So NOAA, when they put out their forecast, puts out a range. And obviously we know with these forecasts, if we put out one number because I think it's a little easier for the general public to grasp one number. If you give them a range, often I see up to, if you give a range of 4 to 8 hurricanes, then they say up to 8 hurricanes, which the general public says is 8 hurricanes. So often I see it tends to go to the high end of the range. So by focusing on one number, at least you get that message out. But obviously we all know these forecasts are uncertain, and the uncertainty is large in April. And so what we do is probabilities of exceedance. So we give a kind of a 70% confidence interval, which is very similar to what NOAA does with theirs. And we have a table in the forecast where we kind of display those. So if you want to do a complete apples to apples comparison with forecasts from other groups. So this is based on effectively, the blue line is the probability of exceedance climatologically, and then the red line is for this current season, basically fitting the observed curve to a statistical model and then adjusting the reducing the spread of that curve, just given the fact that these forecasts have at least a little bit of skill. And the spread of the curve, or the slope of the curve gets a little narrower as you get closer to the season because the historical skill is better. So just to give you an idea, the forecast uncertainty is large. So 6 hurricanes, usually it's plus or minus 2. But you can see, if you're looking at accumulated cyclone energy, you're talking anywhere from, well below normal to all the way up towards borderline hyperactive season. So this gives you an idea of the uncertainty associated with the forecast. So we also are trying a new predictor this year. It says ACE west of 60 degrees. And so, a lot of times people focus on the continental U.S. And, when you're looking at correlations between seasonal forecasts and U.S. landfalls, the correlations, it's there, but it's fairly low on a year-to-year basis. Now, if you say take the 10 years that CSU has forecast the most hurricanes and the 10 years where they forecast the fewest and look at basin-wide, you're starting to get ratios of maybe 3 to 4 to 1. But what I'm looking at here is North Atlantic landfalling hurricanes. So the North Atlantic in this case is any hurricane making landfall anywhere in the basin west of 60 degrees west. So this is, hits the U.S., hits Mexico, hits anywhere in the Caribbean, Canada, Central America, anywhere, that counts as a landfall. And we're only counting basically one landfall per storm. So a storm like Irma, which made like 7, 8 landfalls, just counts as one. Every hurricane that makes landfall counts as one. So you can see if you look at basin-wide accumulated cyclone energy versus North Atlantic landfalls, you do get a robust relationship. But if you do ACE west of 60, you get an improved relationship, and that kind of makes sense, right? Because now we're looking at accumulated cyclone energy in basically the western half of the basin. And there is a little bit of predictability to this quantity. And so basically, what we're doing here, just kind of as a first simple cut, and we're going to be working on this even more to try to get a little more rigorous with it, but at least as a first simple cut, we're basically just doing, when you have an El Nino, you tend to get less ACE west of 60. A couple of reasons, I think. One, they tend to more recurve. There's been some research that's shown that storms in El Nino years tend to more recurve. You also tend to knock down your Caribbean activity, which is typically kind of where you generate a lot of your ACE. So on average, you get about 50% of your ACE west of 60, or a little bit over 50% in an El Nino, about 60% in a La Nina. And so this year, since we're leaning more towards El Nino, the percentage of ACE west of 60 is a little bit lower. We also do probabilities of landfall. And so here, the probabilities on the right-hand side are climatology, and the probabilities on the left are for the 2023 hurricane season. Now, you might be wondering, why are these probabilities just a scooch above average? And it's a little bit, it's a messy signal, and the reason why is because we're using different climatology. So NOAA uses a 30-year climatology for basin-wide activity, but 30 years is not really enough to do a good landfall climatology, because you obviously can have, if you do a 30-year landfall climatology, say for Louisiana, especially if you say we're doing a 10-year climatology, it's going to be way, way higher than maybe like a 30 or 100. So we're using a 140-year climatology, but accumulated cyclone energy is different if you look at 1880 to 2020 versus 91 to 2020. It's quite a bit lower. So it's 123. For the last 30 years, it's 95 over that longer period. Now, is it really 95? No. I guarantee you it's more, but there's not been a published accumulated cyclone energy adjustment factor. There's been estimates of hurricanes. I played around with, assuming every hurricane that they missed was a Category 1 and 2, how much additional ACE would that be? If they get a published ACE uncertainty estimate, we'll use that, but that's the reason why these probabilities are slightly above average, is because the average ACE from 1880 to 2020 was 95, so since we're forecasting 100, it's just slightly above the long-term average. I knew it was a bit confusing, so I wanted to spend a minute doing that, but that's just the different climatologies here. So again, numbers on the right are the historical average, and numbers on the left are for the current season. We also do something which we introduced, I believe it was in 2021, where we basically wanted to say, so a lot of people focus on landfall, and landfall is fine, but obviously we all know a storm doesn't have to make landfall in your county for you to have really significant impacts. So what we did here is we said, let's take a look Basically draw a radius around each county or parish and say, okay, what are the odds that a storm is going to track within 50 miles? And so that can obviously include storms that may landfall in an adjacent county. It can be storms that have been inland and then are kind of hooking back out towards the water. Because obviously if there's a hurricane within 50 miles of your county, it's not going to necessarily be particularly pleasant there. So here we're looking at the Plymouth County, and why I chose Plymouth County, because that's the county I grew up in. Also, it doesn't have a ton, so it didn't look like a complete mess. So there's been 10 hurricanes within 50 miles of Plymouth County from 1880 to 2020. And so basically you can count those storms and then basically calculate probabilities of one or more of those storms being within 50 miles of each county or parish, going basically on climatologically, and then for the current season. So for example, we have these probabilities for each county and parish. We have it for every state. We have it for all the countries in Central America, all the Caribbean islands, all the coastal states in Mexico, all the hurricane-prone provinces in Canada. Tried to hit everything that we could. And so you can see, again, the probability is just a scooch above average because of the forecast of ACE being scooch above the 1880 to 2020 climatology. So certainly invite you to go and check that out. All those stats should be updated on our website now for the 2023 hurricane season. So our forecasts aren't stagnant. We put out our first one today. We'll update it on the 1st of June, another update in early July, and then a final update on the 3rd of August. And I get people saying, oh, 3rd of August, it's 2 months into the hurricane season. It is, but about 95% of your major hurricane activity occurs after the 1st of August. And I can't tell you how many times people have said end of July, early August, oh, the season's a dud, nothing's happened yet. That's common. It's not every season's like 2020 where the ball gets rolling and just keeps on going. A lot of years, not much has happened. 2004 is a great example. The first named storm of the year in 2004 didn't form until August 1st. So just because June and July are quiet doesn't necessarily mean anything. Or if they're busy, doesn't necessarily mean much either. And it gives us one last shot at a mulligan if we realize we really had messed stuff up to that point. So again, the April forecast has the lowest levels of skill historically, and the skill improves as we get closer to the events that we're trying to predict. Kind of like your day-to-day weather prediction. Normally, the forecast for today or tomorrow is pretty good. 10 days out, especially in Colorado. If you look at your phone and look at the 10-day forecast and actually see how that verifies, it can be up by 30, 40 degrees on occasion. So, these forecasts do get better as the season approaches. But if you're like, CSU, they're old news. I want somebody else. There's a lot of somebody else's. We have a website now, seasonalhurricanepredictions.org, which has 28 different groups submitting seasonal hurricane predictions to it. These groups include other universities, private sector weather companies, as well as government agencies. And I will point out there are more universities that are landlocked in landlocked states and then universities issuing seasonal forecasts that actually border an ocean, which I think is interesting. But overall, there is a large number of these groups. They use all sorts of different methodologies. And on the website, you can visualize the forecast, and then you can get a little bit of a discussion of the methodology of what each group does. So let's see. So this is the old view of the website. We actually launched a new improved version of this website like 2 days ago. So if you go to the website now, there should be, I believe, 8 different forecasts on the website, including ours. Hopefully that worked. All of these forecasts are color-coded. So the color codes have changed a little bit, but it's basically you get the idea that private sector weather companies are one color, government agencies are a second, and then universities are a third. The orange dot is the average of all the different forecasts to date, and this is a screenshot from last year. So the average of all of the different groups last year predicted 8 hurricanes, which was dead on. Most other metrics, we were all too high, but for hurricanes, that verified well. The red dot represents the observed value to date, which at that point when I screenshotted this was mid-August last year, we had no hurricanes. So certainly if you're interested in seeing what other people have to say, I invite you to check out that website. We put in a discussion. There's also a write-up that comes out like, okay, the seasonal 15 groups have issued seasonal forecasts so far. In general, they're forecasting, near slightly below normal, probably because of the El Nino potentially coming on, and discussion about that kind of stuff. And with that, I always like to finish with the admonition from Arago, who was the head of the Paris Observatory in the middle of the 19th century. And I certainly think this is very true today. And that is never, no matter what may be the progress of science, will honest scientific men, remember this is the mid-19th century, so honest scientific men or women who have regard for their reputations venture to predict the weather. So with that, I think I'll try to answer any questions, and here's a few ways to get in touch. So thank you.
Hi. Like to talk every year. Do you have any way of predicting dust and including that in the forecast?
Yeah, so we've actually done quite a bit of work looking at basically what does having the dust mean in terms of like seasonal hurricane activity. And using some of the more updated dust products and about 20 years of data, what you find is that if there's a lot of dust in the eastern tropical Atlantic, that's not necessarily a quote-unquote detrimental thing for hurricanes, because when you get vigorous easterly waves coming off, they often bring a lot of dust with them. What we found is that if you start looking at correlations farther to the west, more towards the Caribbean, if there's a lot of dust there, that is basically that's not a good sign for a busy hurricane season. Basically, that tends to mean a quieter season because you've got a pretty strong low-level jet, and you've got a pretty strong trades as well. And obviously, when you have the dust, you have the dry air, the stable air, all that stuff. It tends to be detrimental. So we don't try to predict the dust itself. What we use is effectively some kind of like tracers that kind of correlate pretty strongly with that. So effectively, our best predictor is basically the strength of the trade winds in the Caribbean during the month of July. When those are strong, that tends to mean you have high pressure in the Caribbean, high pressure in the tropical Atlantic, and low pressure near South America, which basically means likely an El Nino and a very stable Atlantic. So when the trades are strong in July, that typically means a quiet season. It's about as good a predictor as you're going to get. It correlates at like 0.85 or so with ACE, which is really, really good for anything. So that's basically what we do. Is we don't necessarily use the dust itself, but we use effectively some proxies that correlate generally pretty strongly with it. And so last year we had a lot of dry air, and some of it was coming from Africa, but some of the stuff that like Jason Dunyan was talking about is that it wasn't necessarily like there was the dust from Africa was that high. It was more that we actually had a lot of dry air coming down. Basically, there was a cutoff low that was bringing a lot of dry air down more from the north. So it was kind of two different sources last year, as opposed to kind of the typical one we always say, oh, it's just coming from Africa. There were actually a lot more coming out of the north last year, which I think is why August last year was, obviously surprisingly quiet for pretty much anyone I don't think anyone was predicting August to have no storms last year.
Hey, Phil.
Yeah, hey.
Great job.
Thanks.
You mentioned briefly, I guess, El Nino years and recurvature. So I guess just asking a bit then, do you address maybe more steering currents in the later forecasts in the summer?
Yeah, and so we've looked at trying to basically predict the steering flow, and unfortunately, even from like a dynamical model perspective, predicting mid-latitude heights is marginal. Even like at a 1 month, like an August 1st forecast, even for August, you get some skill in like week 1, and then it kind of degrades after that. So, the more I think about it too, it is hard. So El Nino tends to load the dice a little bit, but in terms of, even if say you had a reasonably good forecast of say August to September 500 millibar heights in the mid-latitudes, hurricanes come at a very specific time, and so if a 2-month average, that one day there may be something like, it's going to be higher heights, maybe like 67, like the highs aren't necessarily that persistent. They shift and move around a lot. So I'm not sure there's a ton of value even in that. We're looking into it. We've got some stuff that we're looking into, but I'm not even sure. Even if you get a reasonably good forecast, I think for 1 month, that would be pretty helpful. But I think a lot more is just looking week to week. Then I think if you're looking at say like the next 2 or 3 week forecast where you're looking weekly, then you actually do have some skill, and I think that's more obviously when you actually would know, okay, because obviously a lot of it too is where do the storms form? Because obviously if a storm forms right off of Africa, the odds of that hitting Texas are pretty low. Not that it can't, but it's a lot lower that's going to hit Texas than, say, go up the East Coast or just recurve. Whereas if something forms at 60, 70 west, it's probably going to impact somebody because it's really got no place to go where it can hit land. So I think there's some stuff we're working on too. We're trying to do a little more forecasting of not exactly, but more like Genesis regions to see which regions may be more or less likely in a particular year. Yeah.
Yeah, good morning, Phil.
Oh, hey, Chris, how's it going?
Could you go back to the slide showing the 8 analog seasons?
Sure.
There was an interesting question, I think, to address. So your forecast is near average, 100% ACE. When we look at the next to last column, your forecast is 100%, but none of those years are near 100. It's either really busy or really quiet. So is it more likely that that's going to happen rather than
just the
a
dead
near
on average season? Yeah, I mean, I think this may be a year where it's almost a little bit more on the bimodal side, where, obviously if we get a really, really strong El Nino, that, typically kind of the rule of thumb is if you get it more than about 1 degree Celsius warm, it really knocks down the storm activity. If it's a weak El Nino, you can get a really big spread of outcomes. But, rule of thumb also is we haven't really seen a strong El Nino if the Atlantic were to be like record warm at the same time. Like there's some years where the Atlantic's a little warm with a strong El Nino, but not like if you were to just persist the current anomalies in the tropical Atlantic to the peak of the season. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's kind of like there's not a lot of scenarios I think that are really effectively off the table at this point, just given the fact the Atlantic is so warm. I don't think we can, just say, because we're going to get El Nino, we can say the season's going to overall be quieter. I should also point out, because I didn't talk much about probabilities and things, obviously we always emphasize with the seasonal forecast, the message of it only takes one storm, and you can find, years with robust El Ninos like 1965 with Betsy or 57 with Audrey. 83 was not an El Nino year, but 83 only had 4 storms, but obviously 83 had had Alicia. So, I mean, you can get overall, nasty hurricanes making landfall in every year. So from a preparedness perspective, we always emphasize these are informational tools. People are curious. Obviously, there's uncertainty with the forecast, but also, too, in terms of preparedness, we need to prepare the same every hurricane season because, obviously, even in a overall quiet season, you can still have one or more nasty landfalls that obviously cause significant impacts. So I should mention that as well.
Hi. I don't know if it's on. Okay. Hi, my name is Stephanie.
Hey.
I am from the Corpus Christi area, so this question kind of relates back to the fact that I've noticed over the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of storms that really seem to persevere despite a really unfavorable upper air environment. I'm thinking of Nicholas back in 2022 that made a close brush up our coastline, and how tricky that storm was with, well, this is unfavorable, so the center just dissolved, but oh, look, it popped up way over here. So with that in mind, despite not having the best upper air environment, do you think that maybe the strong warmth that we see in the Atlantic might bite us this year? Is that concerning to you?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously hurricanes respond to the local environment. And so you have kind of your dynamics and your thermodynamics. And so typically in an El Nino year, at upper levels in the troposphere, that tends to be a lot warmer. And so that's another kind of, so basically the two reasons that have been basically why El Nino knocks down your storms is the increase in shear, but also the warmer upper troposphere that kind of makes it more stable. Now, obviously, if we were to get a record warm Atlantic, not saying that's going to happen, but if that were to happen, then that make the thermodynamics a little more favorable. Obviously, it's kind of one of those things where it's like the less favorable the dynamics, the more favorable thermodynamics you would need to counteract it. But there's a lot of this moderate wind shear environment, 15, 20 knots. There's a large kind of spread in outcomes, and we see that if you do like climatological studies, even things like rapid intensification or intensification rate, that moderate shear regime is a tricky one. Normally, if the shear gets to a certain threshold, thermodynamics don't necessarily really matter, and kind of gave an example of 2020 when we had Marco in the Gulf. I mean, the Gulf was plenty warm, but obviously the shear was extremely strong and just shredded that storm before it could even get to the coast. Sure. Yeah, hang on, just wait for a microphone. Nick wanted to know when you're coming out with your Boston Red Sox seasonal forecast. Oh, seasonal forecast. Well, since Duvall's injury, probably about 70 wins, unfortunately.
far back are you looking in your analog data set? Because you look at that and almost every single one of them is this century. You got one back in 1969.
Yeah, I mean, mostly that's because of the Atlantic, trying to get the Atlantic warm. Like if you go back historically, the Atlantic's just not as warm. So trying to get stuff where the thermodynamics in the Atlantic are going to be approximately what it is. I mean, we'll go back to 1950. I mean, every now and then even go before then, but just the Atlantic wasn't as warm as it is now. So that's why most of these years are, like you said, we have eight analogs, 7 of them are since 2000 or since 2001.
Plus you probably don't have a good data for the El Nino.
Yeah, as you go back in time, the El Nino, I mean, you have El Nino data, you have water temperature data going back to 1850, 1870, 1880, whatever data set you want to look at, but it does get more uncertain as you go back further in time. There's periods in the historical record where if you believe the data and you correlate, and so with hurricanes, the correlation is 0 for like a 30-year chunk. So whether that's questionable data, whether that's just where the relationship fell apart, like there's some interesting stuff that we can talk about later that kind of goes on when you start going further back in the historical record. But it's also interesting because obviously, again, Bill Gray started these seasonal forecasts using data only since basically from like 1950 to 82, and now I say, well, I'm only going to start by looking at 1979 because that's when the data gets really good. So, you know, in probably 30 years from now, I'll be like, oh, we're going to throw out everything prior to 2020 because we got even better sensors. So, you know, that's at least a good thing, but also, yeah, I mean, it is a challenge. There's always we're always kind of weighing the battle of, do I want to build a model on more years of data where the data is less certain but have more realizations, or do I want to build a model on fewer years of data where the data is of higher quality? And that's, I don't know if there's an answer to that. Try to kind of weigh both and try to do something where you have enough data to have a reliable model, but not go far enough back where you're starting to have real observational challenges.
Hey, Phil.
Hey, Brian.
This is actually a related question, or not question totally, but just, you know, the awareness of what an anomaly is. Like you said, 50 years ago even, what was anomalously warm then would now be normal. Mm-hmm. And so what our anomalously warm conditions are now were unthinkable then. So it's more of an absolute temperature thing. You know, a hurricane doesn't know what an anomaly is. It just knows how warm the ocean is.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, and you know, I mean, obviously, I know we're running over time, but especially the Atlantic, there's pretty pronounced warming trend. The tropical Pacific is a little bit, but the overall trend in the Pacific at the last 30, 40 years has been more towards La Nina. So if you look, say, at linear trend in sea surface temperatures in the eastern central tropical Pacific, it's even slightly negative, whereas everywhere else is pretty much going warm. So basically, kind of do a first order. We're kind of effectively looking at almost like a temperature gradient between the Atlantic and the Pacific. If the Atlantic is warm, if the Atlantic minus Pacific, if the Atlantic is warm relative to the Pacific, that basically means air going up over the Atlantic. If it's the other way around, it tends to suppress your activity. So that, in a first order nutshell, is kind of what our statistical dynamical models are looking at, is effectively how is that gradient going to be, where when you have both saying both are going to be super warm, then you have, it's still kind of that tug of war, whereas obviously if one's warm and one is average, then the one that's warm is going to really dominate. So I would say on average, you know, I put more eggs in the El Nino basket. If we get a strong El Nino, probably the season is going to, we'll probably be, you know, lowering the numbers. But if the models are all too aggressive and the El Nino comes in but it's kind of weak, then certainly the fact the Atlantic is as warm as it is something we need to pay attention to. Yeah, I saw Brian right there.
So on a related thought about what is an average season, you know, what should we think of as being an average season? Because the average that NOAA uses, the 1991, right? If you believe Kerry Emanuel, then you know it's never going to get cool again, right? Because that was the tail end of the volcanic and European pollution cooling, right, into the mid 90s. And also you have the change in technology and so forth since the early 2000s. So an average season these days feels to me like it's more than 14.4, you know, maybe it's 15 or 16 storms. So I'm just, you know, wondering if in your statistics and in your thinking, if, you know, if that kind of, it's taken into account in some sense, similar to what Brian was saying, if the world is just different now, both just, you know, the way the world works and also the technology.
Yeah, and so, when it comes to climate normals, so the World Meteorological Organization says 30-year climate normals. In general, for the Atlantic, that doesn't work great. I personally prefer 50. We actually published a paper showing that 30 years in general has lower levels of skill. So basically, the idea is that the 30-year average should effectively be like your no-skill metric. So if you're trying to forecast, you should be able to beat the 30-year average, because if you're not, then you should just, you can calculate a 30-year average. But if you look historically, a 50-year average actually works better. And so the 70s and 80s were knocked down. We didn't have many storms. Probably some of that was due to the increase in aerosols, but I think there was definitely oceanic circulation issues as well, because you can go back historically and find other quiet versus active periods. Yeah, the 30-year climatology of 14.7 and 3, if you say 14.7 and 3 30 years ago, we would call that probably an above normal season, depending on how things played out. NOAA's definition before 2 years ago, 111 ACE was considered above normal, I believe. And that's lower now than the 91 to 2020 climatology. But I do point out, NOAA uses a kind of a mishmash where they use average 91 to 2020 for named storms, hurricanes, and majors, and they use percentage of median ACE from 51 to 2020. So they use kind of an amalgam, but I want to use the same thing for everything, and unfortunately I don't think that many people understand what the median is anyway. So we use an average for everything just to make it easy to compare, so you're not comparing too many different things at once. But overall, globally, we've actually seen a decrease in overall number of hurricane strength systems, because Atlantic's going this way, but if you have La Nina driving the bus, that tends to really knock down the Pacific, and since the Pacific is a larger ocean, more ocean heat content, generally the last few years have been pretty quiet, and even the last 30 years have trended down in the Pacific. So globally, hurricane numbers are actually down. Hurricane strength storms, so including typhoons in the western North Pacific. So there's a lot of different things going on. This year will probably at least stabilize that trend towards La Nina, but that's something I think that's, we got to really understand better if we're going to understand future hurricane risk globally, is to understand, is this trend towards La Nina just a 30-year blip, or is this something that is more longer term? Because obviously that means busy for the Atlantic, but obviously quieter for the Pacific, so big impacts in terms of regionalization as well. Yeah, one more. Let Rob close us out here.
Don't have a stroke, Rob.
Yeah. Hey, it seems like in these El Nino years, when we're looking for the Gulf of Mexico, there always seems to be a 1 to 2 week forecast period where that shear goes away and you're looking for potential candidates. When you're doing those 2 to 3 week forecasts, what's the proxy that you look at for saying, it's going to be open for business for this 1 to 2 week period where the shear is going to be reduced across the MDR and the Western Atlantic?
Yeah, so a lot of that's basically signal from equatorial waves. So the Madden-Julian Oscillation, Kelvin waves, equatorial Rossby waves, so atmospheric Rossby waves. Yeah, so there's a few of these different things that we can look at, and then also just looking at just the forecasts for shear. Because the model's out to about 2 weeks for shear, because basically what I would kind of look at is if basically, usually the plots are red is high shear, blue is low shear. If I look at the main development region and it's blue, normally that means something's going to go. Not always. Late August it was blue and we still had nothing. But in general, that tends to mean if your shear is low, that tends to be kind of what kind of gives you that open window for storms. Now, typically in an El Nino year, you knock down your shear in the you increase your shear in the tropics, but you actually reduce your shear in the subtropics at higher latitudes, which normally those storms are shorter lived, often just recur about the sea, so not necessarily that big of an issue. But the shear signal is definitely what really the El Nino does is knocks down your shear in the deep tropics and the Caribbean. So it knocks down your ACE, it knocks down your major hurricanes, but it's not to say you can't get stuff at higher latitudes. So it's not to say that you're going to see like 83 we had 4 storms or something like that. You can still get stuff at higher latitudes, especially when the Atlantic if the Atlantic's extra warm. That kind of, so again, probably lower impacts, not necessarily as much ACE, but not to say you couldn't get storms up there. Sure.
Okay, let's give another round.
Thanks.
Of applause. Thank you, Phil. I don't know about you guys, but every year I learn something new from Dr. K's wonderful work. It's a great presentation, Phil. Okay, we'll have a break now. Tim and his brothers will be going around with cattle prods to bring you back in when it's time to start up again.